Okay, guys, so a few things that we're going to look at today. Um, so we're looking at lab experiments, and just going back from last week's lesson, have a think about some of these. So, can you name three ethical guidelines in psychology? So, can you remember from last lesson at least three of those guidelines? Um, and the newcomer study. I didn't go through this in the video, but the file is there for you to read. So read through that study if you haven't already, and see if you can find an ethical issue with their study. And also, how do psychologists deal with ethical guidelines if they need to be broken? So remember, we looked at how ethical guidelines generally are followed, but there are times where you might have to break one of them, but there has to be a good reason for it. So just again, look at that and think, what could these reasons actually be? So today we're going to look at lab experiments. We're going to see how we design actual lab experiments. So some key terms for you to look at here today. Again, lab experiment variables. So what is a variable? There are different types of variables. There are independent or there are dependent variables. And there are also extraneous variables. You have a control in psychology, so you need to know what a control is, what a control group is, or a control is. Um, Experiments are standardized. There's a process called standardization. What does that mean as well? Or maybe things are randomized as well. And also, you have this concept of single blind and double blind testing as well. So we'll talk about that. And this idea of counterbalancing, how you counterbalance different groups, for example. So these are the kind of keywords for this part of research methods. This is what you would need to know. Okay, so first of all, what do you think a laboratory experiment is? What's your idea of a lab experiment? So what would you picture? What kind of things happen? Why is it important, do you think, to do experiments in laboratories? But what do scientists get from doing it in a lab setting compared to just in the middle of a park or a shopping mall, for example? So this is what we're trying to get at here. Okay, so lab experiment, it's controlled. It's a controlled environment. Independent variables are manipulated, dependent variables are measured, and other variables are controlled. Okay, so the key word here is that it gives the researcher an element of control. So there is a variable, something in your experiment that you're looking at that you can manipulate, that you can change, you can tweak, you can make some changes to, and a dependent variable which is measured. The dependent variable is something that comes out of the changes that you're making, and we'll give you some examples of this to make it clear, because this is somewhere where students do get confused between the two and what they mean. So these are all features of lab experiments. Now, lab experiments themselves, they want to discover cause and effect between this IV and DV, the independent variable and the dependent variable. If you change this, does this happen? This is essentially what lab experiments are looking at, a cause and effect. If this happens, does this happen? So what are these different types of variables? Any factor that can vary or change in a study, something that can change, something that you can change. So an independent variable is a factor which is changed by the experimenter. A dependent variable, something which is measured by the experimenter. And how you should actually do this as a researcher, as a psychologist, you need to operationalize these. So you have to write them in a way that you can actually test and you can measure as well. You also have control variables, factors that stay the same during an experiment as well. So when do we kind of use these lab experiments? So maybe we might use them for studying behavior that's not affected by the artificial environment of the laboratory. So again, some tests that you might do, people might be influenced to behave in a certain way outside of a lab. Whereas some tests, if it doesn't have that impact, if it's not like a day-to-day task, maybe the lab won't affect their results as much. So, for example, if you're doing a test on memory or reaction times, for example, these would be good ones to do in a laboratory because they're useful if you need to isolate the independent variable and the dependent variable. You also have something called extraneous variables. See, these are any factors which are not the independent variable, but they might affect the results of the study if they're not controlled. So this is why, for example, if you were doing a test in a shopping mall or a public setting, anything could happen. Maybe it's a bit more of an unpredictable place. So that's why if you do something in a laboratory, you try and get rid of more of these extraneous variables. Okay, so let's give you an example here. And looking at the different types of variables, what are they here? Miss Maiden wanted to see whether year 9s or year 10s are better at psychology. So she got a group of year 9s and a group of year 10s. She gave them the same test and then compared the scores to see who was better. So first, what is the operationalized dependent variable here? So what is the final thing that she's measuring? And what is the operationalized independent variable? So what is she changing to get her results? So what's actually changing here? What does she want to change? So here, the dependent variable, the final measurement, what depends on what she does, is the actual score. Now, the independent variable here is what she has decided to change. So what has she changed? She has changed the group, the year 9 group, and then a year 10 group. Now, if she got a different group, a year 11 group, a year 12 group, and she could also operationalize this, and this would make a difference to her results, or maybe even a different class, for example. Okay. Now, a challenge for you is an extraneous variable of the experiment. What could be an extraneous variable? What kind of things could have affected this? And could it have been controlled? So I think in your school, if you just got 2 random classes and made this comparison, what other things do you need to consider? Are all classes the same? Do they have the same kind of students? Are all students of the same ability? Have all students studied psychology before? Living in Doha, you're in a school where English is not the first language for many students as well. Is that going to affect it? These could be some examples, but could you think of any others as well that could help you here? The other thing that you can have a look at yourself is the Stroop test. I've attached that as well. That's a fun activity for you to do. So you can kind of go through that, but I won't go through it on the slide. Now, but the Stroop test itself, if you do this, I want you to have a look through and think about the same thing. What is the dependent variable in the Stroop test? What is the operationalized independent variable there? Are there any ethical issues with it? Are there any extraneous variables? And how would you have changed the design of the experiment to overcome the problems? Okay, so make sure you go through that as well. Now, in terms of just a few other points on this for this week. So again, these are some of the key terms. I'll go through a few more of these. Extraneous variables themselves. Look through this. Have a look how extraneous variables could have been controlled in the study that I've attached. Read the experiment information carefully and just make sure you just go through anything you don't understand. Send me a message about that. Okay. Again, look through these questions here. Okay. And I want you to look through the meanings of these terms. I've attached a document that goes through all of these. Make sure you've gone through these, you understand the meaning of them. Ask me any questions if you're not sure. Again, highlight any of the key points as well. So there are lots of questions in here. There's a lot of material to go through this week, but I want to make sure that you fully understood this. So do show me in your notes that you have done this. Go back to the newcomer study from last time. Look at these. Think about all of the studies that you've done so far in psychology and how you would apply it. What are the variables in each of these studies? So you can kind of look through the textbook, go through the studies, and then go through it that way as well. Okay, there are also some exam question practice as well that you can go through. And again, lots and lots of questions on this, lots of things that you can go through here as well. And yeah, that's it for now. Just let me know if you have any questions, but I want this to be done for next week. Go through all of the material, go through the PowerPoints yourself, go through all of the challenge questions. The challenge questions are the ones in red here. So you have everything you need here on Classroom. You've got the PowerPoints, you've got the Word documents, okay, explaining all the keywords. There's a list in here, just kind of going through all of these, and some practice questions as well. So plenty for you to be getting on with for next time. Okay.